In this last presentation, let's talk about human resources. Sometimes this stuff is a little bit boring for us technology people, I think, but certainly HR. If we understand how this stuff works and how it affects us, it'll certainly help our department be more successful. And also, there are a lot of issues that IT security has to work with HR, probably more so than many other departments. So we're going to kind of go through the whole process here of things that we worry about as far as hiring employees, whether they're in IT security or general employees. We'll talk about different concerns for both. Ongoing issues with employees as they're employed with the organization and things that were touch points with HR. And then finally, termination of employees or separation from employees and things we have to worry about in IT security. And I'll also talk about some different types of employees within an organization, like temporary workers and so forth, and some special concerns we have with them as well. So let's get started. So, employee policies and practices for employment. The organization should make information security a documented part of every employee's job description. So, we should codify policies and procedures into those job descriptions as best as we can, especially for those roles that it directly affects their role in the organization, the IT security. Management community of interest should integrate solid concepts for information security into the organization's employment policies and practices. Information security perspective, hiring of employees are responsible, laden with potential security pitfalls, and so forth. And the CISO and information security manager should work with HR to incorporate information security into the guidelines used for hiring all personnel. In other words, we want to make sure that our concerns in IT security are heard to the human resources department when they're hiring anyone. So this is one more metric by which they're measuring potential candidates that we're going to hire in the organization to make sure that they're right for our organization, depending on what our security posture needs to be. So job descriptions, I already talked about how important job descriptions are. So integrating information security perspectives into the hiring process begins with reviewing and updating all job descriptions. So anyone that has any touch points with IT security, we want to update those job descriptions. This isn't just people that work in IT security. We're talking about any role in the organization that we have some concern with IT security. Maybe somebody in financial or somebody who deals with private records and things like that. For example, I work extensively in healthcare, and in my field in healthcare, in IT security, we're concerned that doctors and nurses and things like that they understand that one of their jobs is to protect patient data and to make sure that they're complying with HIPAA rules. They are bound by HIPAA laws. That's their responsibility. They are what we call covered entities that are bound by those laws and regulations, which we've talked a little bit about those before. So it's important that they understand that that's part of their job description. So that's an example of, even though a doctor or a nurse is not somebody who works in IT security, it's something that we integrate into their job description to make sure that it's well understood that it's an important part of their job, that they have to be aware of those things. So with interviews, an opening within the Information Security Department creates a unique opportunity for security manager to educate HR on certifications, experience, qualifications of a good candidate. So we want to make sure that they understand all of the latest trends and certifications and what they mean and how that might affect a hiring decision. You have to remember something about HR. They are the gatekeepers of all of our candidates for most jobs in major and larger organizations and enterprises. So, as a hiring manager, you're not going to have resumes for every single person that applies to the job. What happens is your HR department is going to get those resumes. They're going to filter out all the ones that they believe are not good candidates, and they're going to leave you with a list of what they think are the good candidates. And what you don't want to happen is, number one, you don't want to get resumes that are going to waste your time. And number two, you don't want to be missing the good ones because you gave them some metric that they really didn't understand enough about the background certifications to know that somebody was a good candidate. This actually happened to a good friend of mine who works at a hospital up in New York. And he was lamenting to me one day. He said, I've been trying to find somebody, but I can't find any good candidates. He said, HR told me they're just not getting any resumes for anyone that's that I can hire for this position. And I asked him and I said, are you sure they're not getting the resumes, or are they not giving you the resumes? He's like, I'm pretty sure they are not getting the resumes. So I told him, go talk to your HR department and find out if they're getting resumes, but they're just filtering all of them out so you can't interview these people. So the next day he goes to the HR department and under my advice, he asked them that question. He said, are you getting resumes? Well, they were getting resumes, and he said, you know what? I want to see all the resumes we're getting. He found 10 or 15 very good resumes of good people that he could hire that were well qualified. And he asked the HR, why didn't you give me these resumes? Well, they didn't meet all of the points that you gave me. So there was kind of a disconnect there. So he's assuming that there's no qualified candidates. Meanwhile, there's a stack of great candidates sitting there on the desk. And it takes kind of that judgment call. So it's kind of important to make sure that they understand as much as possible about what you're looking for. So organizations that include on-site visits as part of the interview, one thing we have to be concerned with in IT security is when they're showing a candidate around the facility, make sure that we're not opening up too much information for reconnaissance. So going on a job interview is a great way to learn about a company. When you go to a job interview, they treat you as an insider. They divulge everything about the organization when you go to a job interview. They talk to you. They want to make sure you understand the job, and they're explaining everything. Sometimes they're excited about it. They'll take you and show you around the facility and so forth. But you have to be aware that there's certainly information that they could see or that could be divulged that maybe shouldn't be. So certainly something to make HR aware of in the interview process. So some of the hiring issues, and we'll talk about these. You've got background checks, verifying certifications, making sure that new hires understand policies and procedures. There's always the contracts that have to be signed, covenants and agreements. So we'll talk about a few of these. First, background check should always be conducted before you extend an offer to a candidate. Again, whether it's IT security or not. Obviously, in IT security, we want to do background checks because we want to make sure there's no criminal background that might predispose that person to, because they're going to have a very trusted access to the organization in IT security. Not unlike somebody who's an armed security guard guarding money, right? We're entrusting them to guard this asset. So in IT security, there's obviously some assets that we have to be concerned about. So background checks are important. But also background checks are important generally for the organization from an IT security perspective. Again, depending on the role that we're hiring for, we want to make sure that they're aware of certain sensitivities for different roles. And again, going back to the job descriptions, that's something we could do. When we go through the standard job descriptions that the organization has, we can identify roles that are especially important for background checks and things that they should be looking for. Investigation, so usually a background involves an investigation into the candidate's past. It can differ in the level of detail and depth depending on the type of job that you're looking for. Sometimes it's just a simple credit check. Sometimes it's a little more in depth. Sometimes it's also a criminal background check. Sometimes they look into your driving records, drug history, and so forth and so on. There are companies that do background checks. It's like a menu. You tell them what you're interested in. They charge you a price per background check. There certainly is a significant fee to do background checks, but it's well worth it in the end if it filters out candidates that are not appropriate because of their background. Usually when we hire somebody, you have an employment contract. So once the candidate has accepted a job offer, an employment contract is an important security instrument because the contract is going to have elements in there that we might talk about IT securities, things like non-disclosure agreements, agreements to be monitored while working, so they can, one thing that a lot of folks don't realize is that there is an expectation of privacy even in your workplace. And the only way to absolve us of that privacy, of that expectation of privacy for employees, is to make sure that we have something in writing where the employee understands that we're going to be monitoring their emails possibly, and maybe monitoring communication in and out of the workplace. So those things all have to be in a written agreement. And again, that's going to happen in an employee contract. And that has to be done prior to the employee being hired for it to have the best chance of standing up in court. Policies governing employee behavior can be classified as employment contingent upon agreement, where the employee agrees to conform with the policies before they are hired. Again, all of this should be done prior to being hired. One of the things that's been challenged before is employees being hired and then being forced to sign an agreement or a contract after they have accepted employment and have started working for the company. It's one thing to agree to something before you're working for the company, but if you're forced to sign a contract to maintain employment, it's sort of signing a contract under duress, and it's certainly arguable in court. And many companies do it anyway. They change policies and procedures, and they tell you have to sign the new policy and procedure. I've had jobs where they certainly do that. Once we hire employees, we'll also typically have an orientation. Now, in IT security, the reason we care about these orientations is we want to make sure that IT security issues are discussed in the orientation. So we want to work with the people that are putting together these new hire orientations and make sure that new employees are given information about what's expected of them with IT security, with policies and procedures related to IT security. Levels of authorized access should be outlined. Training is going to be provided on secure use of information systems, things like how to manage passwords and things like that we talk about in a course like this. We certainly want to make employees aware of some of those issues. So by the time they start, they should be thoroughly briefed on security components and their rights and responsibilities as it respects to IT security. So all of that stuff should be reviewed and understood in the new hire orientation. We certainly don't want a situation where people are starting their job and they're not aware of these policies and procedures. We don't want people to violate them, right? We want to make sure they understand them. So security training is ongoing. So even after an employee has been working for the company, we're going to do some ongoing security training. We're going to integrate security awareness training into job orientation and security training. We talked a little bit about awareness training before. We're going to talk about it again in this course later on. Keeping security at the forefront of employees' minds helps minimize their mistakes. It's an important part of the information security awareness mission. External and internal seminars can be used to increase security awareness for all employees, particularly security employees, especially if they're conducting that training, because it keeps things certainly in the front of your mind and you're an expert. I can tell you for sure that teaching is one of the best ways to learn. I learn more, I think, from teaching than I ever learned taking a class. I highly recommend it. Performance evaluation. So for sure, if we're in a management position or a C-level position, performance evaluations are important for us. But the flip side of this is, from an IT security perspective, if we can get IT security benchmarks into performance evaluations, then it's much more likely that employees are going to pay very close attention to how they are complying with those policies and procedures. So you can get acceptance and buy-in for IT security policies and procedures if it's part of their performance evaluations. So if there are performance metrics that relate to how they properly follow those guidelines and policies and procedures, then people are going to be more likely to follow those. But if those policies and procedures don't have a lot of teeth, and it's not obvious to people how it's going to affect their performance, then they may not be as apt to follow them. So without a doubt, when anything is wrapped into performance evaluations, people are always thinking about their performance in job roles, right? They think about, what am I doing that's going to, at my yearly evaluation, make me seem like a better employee and make me more likely to get my 1 or 2% raise or whatever it is. So for sure, performance evaluations and codifying these things into performance evaluations is one of the many tools that we have to help secure or help make sure that people are abiding by our policies and procedures. So the final step in the life cycle of employment is termination. So when an employee leaves the organization, there are security-related issues, and this is pretty obvious that we have to be sensitive to when an employee is separating from the organization. So one key issue is continuity of protection of all the information to which the employee had access. So we have to make sure that if all the information they had access to, that they properly separate from that access somehow. So after having delivered keys, key cards, business property, the former employees should be escorted from the premises so they don't have access to those things again. Many organizations can use an exit interview to remind the former employee of contractual obligations and to obtain feedback and, of course, to turn in all that stuff. And there are two types of departures we talk about. One is called a hostile departure, and the other one is goodness, what do they call it? There's a hostile departure and a friendly departure. Sorry. So a hostile departure is before the employee. So this is usually a departure because of a downsizing, layoffs, or maybe there's some wrongdoing from the employee and they're being fired, right? They're being let go because of some performance reason or something like that. Anything where it's the employee is not leaving willingly, right? In some cases, quitting can be hostile because sometimes people get so disgruntled with their job, screw this place, I'm out of here, right? And they want to, bring down the whole organization on their way out. So they could certainly be hostile. But anytime, we suspect a hostile departure, we want to make sure before the employee is aware that all their logical and key card access is terminated. You might be saying, gee, Brian, you just told me that sometimes a person quitting is a hostile departure. And if you suspect that, so it's pretty commonplace for people to give 2 weeks notice when they quit a job. And if it's suspected that this person is going to be trouble, is going to be a hostile instance of quitting or a hostile departure, then the recommendation is to shut off the access prior to the date of departure, and just tell that person you're taking the last 2 days off. And that kind of nips it in the bud. It kind of prevents them from doing anything on their last day. So any plans they had of deleting a bunch of data or stealing the keys or stealing money or whatever it is or leaving behind a virus, they all kind of go out the window because they lose that window of opportunity. So certainly one strategy. One thing I can tell you from employment law perspective that you have to be careful is when you do that, when somebody gives notice and you force them to leave prior to the notice and you don't pay them up to that 2 weeks notice. One important thing to be aware of is that sometimes they can collect unemployment, but sometimes the cost of that is less than the damage that they would have done otherwise. Employee collects all their belongings, surrenders their key cards, keys, any company property, company cell phones, laptops, things like that, and then they're escorted out of the building without being able to access that any of that equipment or infrastructure. A friendly departure is when somebody resigns. It could be retirement. It could be a promotion to another job or to a job internally in a different department. It could be a relocation to another building or another division in a large enterprise. So the employee may be notified well in advance of their departure date. It's more difficult for the security to maintain positive control because they're going to have access to everything up until their last day. But, it's a friendly departure, so usually we can trust that that person isn't going to do anything stupid. Employee accounts usually continue with a new expiration date, so, we'll go in and put an expiration date to say after this date they can no longer access their account. One of the challenges is that the employees can come and go at will. They can collect their own belongings and leave on their own. For sure, we want to make sure that we collect any company property and so forth, just like we do with a hostile departure. But again, it might be a little bit easier in the case of a friendly departure. In most cases, employees in a friendly departure are happy to get rid of those things. They're made the choice to leave, and they're not bitter about it, and maybe that's a better opportunity or retirement. I have to tell you, if I was retiring, here, take all this stuff, take my company phone, take my company laptop. I don't want this stuff anymore. If I'm retiring, gosh, I got 30 more years to go. So that thought of retiring sounds pretty great, but it's a long way off. So post termination. So after termination, we want to do some kind of a audit or inventory of all of the files that the employee had access to. Which ones do we need to keep? Which ones do we need to get rid of? Our data retention policies are going to be, we're going to look at those data retention policies that we talk about in the policy section of the course. It's possible that employees foresee departure well in advance to begin collecting organizational information for their future employment. That's a huge concern. People collecting customer lists and things like that. So we want to look for any evidence that that's happened and make sure that we report that sort of thing. Only by scrutinizing system logs after the employee's departed can we determine if there has been a breach of policy or loss of information. So again, we can audit what they've done after they leave to see if there's any evidence of any of these things happening. All right, if information has been illegally copied or stolen, report the incident and follow the appropriate policy, which I just mentioned. So non-employees. So, there's different types. Mostly what I've been talking about is employees, full-time or part-time employees that are employed by the organization in a traditional employee and employer relationship. But we also have non-employees, which are not subject to screening, contractual obligations, eventually secured termination, often have access to sensitive organizational information. So it's a much more loose engagement that we have with non-employees. So they have to be carefully managed to prevent possible information leakage and theft and things like that. One example is temporary workers, or temps, short for temps. They're hired to serve in a temporary position, usually with an expiration date. We're hiring them for 6 weeks or 6 months, or whatever, maybe to temporarily fill a role for an employee that's on disability, or something along those lines. Or maybe we have a ramping up of work that we're going to bring in temporary employees to do that work. So they're not subjected to the same contractual obligations as our normal employees would be. But if they're temporary employees and they violate a policy, we might be limited in what we can do, although, we can certainly escort them out the door. But they do have access to information, just like our regular employees do. So we want to make sure we limit what they can access to only what they need to do their job. So it's certainly something to be aware of. Temporary employee supervisor has to restrict the information to which they can access. Contract employees are usually, it's a slightly different relationship than an employee. So contract is more like a consultant, sort of. The host company makes a contract with a parent organization other than the individual for a particular task. So in a secure facility, all contract employees are escorted from room to room as well as into and out of the facility. Gosh, that's kind of overkill. A lot of companies don't do that. I've worked on contract for companies many times, and I very few times do I remember being, escorted room to room. But certainly it's something that you could do. But you do have to make sure that you restrict what that person can do when they're a contract, because again, they're not under the same obligations as your regular employees. And you have to remember too that their fiduciary responsibilities are not to the organization; they're usually to whomever they work for. So I work for a company that is a contractor for hospitals. So I'm frequently brought into hospitals as a contractor, and my primary responsibility is to my company, not to the hospital that I'm working for. So again, it's something to be aware of. And of course, I'm trying to do the right thing for the hospital because they're paying us. But at the end of the day, my number one priority has to be to the company for whom I work. So certainly something to be aware of. Same with consultants; they have the same relationship where their fiduciary responsibility is to their company and their organization. So certainly something to be aware of. Um, so just like a contractor, they have to be screened, typically escorted. Non-disclosure agreements can be important for consultants because a lot of times they're dealing with a consultant could be at a higher level. You saw in the previous presentation, the first slide deck for this unit, I showed you how consultants might work directly in the C-suite. So they might be privy to a lot of privileged information. So non-disclosures would certainly be important in that case. All right, business partners. These would be things like vendors. Anybody who you're bringing into the organization periodically to do work. You have to determine, what information you're exchanging with business partners. How is it being secured? Are you doing VPNs? Great example of this is support. So, in any organization, IT is going to have a lot of infrastructure that's going to be supported by third parties. It's going to be supported by the vendor that sold it. It could be supported by a third-party company. They're paying for support. But either way, those companies need to access those systems. So a big part of IT security's job is to figure out how to give secure access to those vendors. And not just secure access, but also auditable access. You want to be able to audit their activities. What systems are they accessing it? When are they accessing it? And change management. Are they making changes to that? You want to be able to audit those types of things. So lots of concerns there with business partners as far as access to information, especially vendors that are doing support. But you certainly have to provide that access because obviously they can't support those systems if they can't access them. So internal control strategies. We're going to switch gears here back to regular employees for a minute, and talk about different ways we can provide for control. One of the first things we talk about in IT security as far as employees is separation of duties. And basically what that means is for a high-risk task, you have to have multiple people involved in that task. The whole goal here for all of these control strategies, the main goal is to reduce the risk of fraud and theft. And let's use a bank as an example. If you're a teller at a bank and you can write cashier's checks, right? Somebody comes in and wants to draw a check from the bank. So I bring in $100 and I get a cashier's check for $100. Although now you have to pay fees, but let's pretend there's no fees for a moment. But I have $100 and I want to get a $100 cashier's check. I hand the $100 to the teller. She writes out a check and signs it and gives it back to me. I walk out and I've got a check for the bank and I can go take that anywhere. But what if that teller realizes, wait a minute, if I can just give out checks drawn on the bank, why can't I just write out a check for $500,000, go cash it down the street, and then go to Mexico, right? What's going to stop that from happening? Well, there should be a policy that a single teller can't do that, that a teller, before they can, if they're going to print a check, somebody else has to sign it. And there should be some controls in place to make sure there's a separation of those duties. So in order for somebody to commit fraud, they have to collude with another employee, which makes fraud much less likely to happen when they have to collude with somebody else to make it happen. So that's certainly one way we can reduce fraud and theft and so forth and so on. So two-man controls would be two individuals review and approve each other's work, which I kind of just explained. Same concept. Job rotation, so employees know each other's job skills. So you don't have a single person always doing the same job. Ensures that no employee performs actions that cannot be physically audited by another employee. In other words, if I'm the only person who knows how to do invoicing and nobody else knows how to do that, no one else can audit the work that I'm doing because they don't know how it works. So it's important to make sure that lots of people know how to do. There's no single person that can it's indispensable. And the other concept here is the old hit by the bus theory. If I'm the only person that can do invoicing and I get hit by a bus, that goes back to availability. Now there's nobody available that can perform that function, and it affects the business. Garden leave used by some employees to restrict the flow of proprietary information when an employee leaves to join a competitor. So again, it's important to make sure that when employees leave to join a competitor, that you protect the information from getting to the competitor. Although there's other flip sides to that too. Competition sometimes can when you have multiple competitors in a single market, employees moving between companies, sometimes you want a little bit of that information flowing back and forth. I know it sounds crazy for an IT security person to say that, but there is research that shows that does help with innovation and things like that. But certainly we have to make sure we do our best to prevent that from happening anyway. Least privilege. Only employees with real business need to use the system or information should be allowed to do so. One of the other ones I want to mention is forced vacations. And I've been burned by this a few times, where you have an employee that knows how to do a job and nobody else does that job. So this kind of goes back to job rotation. But that employee basically always does that one particular job, and they never take a vacation. That's a red flag, because the reason they're probably not taking a vacation is not because they're a dedicated employee typically. It's more so because they don't want anybody else to see what's happening, right? And that could be for two reasons. It could be, number one, because of theft and fraud, right? It could be, I want to be the only person that does this so nobody can catch on to what it is that I'm doing. And sometimes it's just because the job's not being done very competently and they're kind of afraid that somebody's going to figure out how crappy they're doing the job. And I've had both of these things happen to me, where there's been somebody in the organization that never takes a vacation and always does that. Or they take vacations and say, hey, don't worry about doing the invoicing because I'm going to do it while I'm on vacation. And you think, oh, what a great guy. He's going to go ahead and remote in and take care of all this stuff while he's on vacation. But then you find out after they leave the company that it was such a disaster and a mess. Now you have to clean it up. And now you're going to lose out on all these billable hours that aren't going to get billed while you're trying to figure out how to clean up this problem. That type of example. So forced vacations is another technique that you could use. Finally, the last thing I'm going to talk about is privacy and the security of personnel data. So as far as HR issues go for IT security, I've talked about all these different touch points with HR, but one of the important things about HR is they have so much information about employees. All of our personal information is typically stored in an HR information system, or an HRIS. And in a lot of cases, there's a lot of very sensitive information in there. One technique a lot of companies have used to protect all that very sensitive information in HR is they have dedicated IT people that work for the HR department. So they're part of the HR department. You're not relying on the wider, IT team to take care of that stuff. So, and if you think about it, the HR department has all the salaries, all the tax information. There's a lot of very private things there. Um, so information security groups should ensure that these data receive at least the same level of protection as other important organizational data. So we have to make sure that HR data is secure, and it's important to understand how sensitive that HR data actually is. As sensitive, if not more so, than a lot of the other data that we deal with in IT security. So again, something to be aware of. So that concludes the section of the course where we talk about HR, hiring, firing, and how that affects IT security. So we kind of talked about it in two ways. We talked about IT security as it relates to human resources, hiring and firing, and finding people, and job descriptions and things like that. But I also talked about these issues specific to IT security when we're hiring and firing people for IT security. How we find these people, how we vet their background, and we also talked about our own professional development, through certifications and things of that nature. All right, so that's it for this unit. Thank you for watching.